Freeze. You're under arrest for illegal flower planting. HOA Karen screamed it at my wife, like she'd cornered a violent felon instead of a woman kneeling in loose soil. Tracy froze as 3 badge-flashing strangers closed in and snapped cuffs around her wrists over yellow marigolds planted in our own yard. Neighbors gathered and cheered while phones rose, and my quiet weekend shattered into a live-streamed accusation with me labeled a rogue federal agent. HOA Karen basked in the noise, confident, theatrical, certain that borrowed authority would carry her through. I stood still because shock can paralyze even trained people when the violation is sudden and public. This was not enforcement. It was humiliation performed for an audience that didn't yet know it was being lied to. What HOA Karen didn't understand was that she had just crossed from nuisance into felony territory. Within 90 minutes, her flower fantasy would collapse into the most documented neighborhood meltdown I'd ever seen. The reversal was already loading, even if no one else could see it yet. Before we move forward, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? I've spent nearly 2 decades in federal law enforcement, and in all that time I'd learned to recognize the sound a situation makes when it goes wrong. It isn't loud at first. It's hollow, like air getting sucked out of a room before the windows blow. That sound hit when HOA Karen kept talking, stacking accusations with the confidence of someone who believed rules were weapons meant for other people. She paced, narrated, and framed my wife for the camera as if she were rescuing the neighborhood from a hidden threat. The strangers with her played their parts, one reading from a phone, another hovering with a clipboard, all of them pretending procedure made them legitimate. Tracy looked up at me, confusion breaking into fear, asking without words how flowers had turned into handcuffs. I didn't answer because the lie was moving too fast, and lies gain power when they're allowed. HOA Karen told the crowd she was protecting a vulnerable woman from intimidation, and the chat filled with praise as if reality were optional. The cuffs clicked tighter, and the sound carved a line through my head that separated patience from response. I felt the familiar cold settle in, the kind that replaces panic with clarity when training takes over. People mistake calm for surrender, and HOA Karen made that mistake loudly. She mistook my stillness for compliance and the crowd's noise for consent. She mistook costumes for authority and performance for law. She mistook a cabin weekend for weakness. She mistook my silence for ignorance. Each mistake stacked until there was nowhere left for her to stand. The neighbors didn't know my name. Only the caricature HOA Karen was selling them in real time. They didn't know the difference between a badge bought online and a badge backed by statute. They didn't know that live streams don't just spread stories, they preserve evidence. They didn't know that every second they cheered was being archived from angles HOA Karen couldn't control. Tracy didn't know why this was happening, and that ignorance hurt more than the cuffs. She kept asking what she'd done wrong, and every non-answer deepened the violation. Thanks, Chom. Karen leaned in close and spoke softly for the camera, telling Tracy she was safe now, telling her she didn't have to protect me anymore. That line was rehearsed, delivered with practiced pity, and it landed like a trigger. I recognized it as a pivot from rules to narrative, from enforcement to control. This was never about flowers, and it never had been. It was about spectacle, and spectacle needs a villain to function. HOA Karen had chosen me for the role without knowing the cost of casting. She kept talking about community standards while trespassing on our property and inventing authority that didn't exist. She kept saying, "arrest," as if repetition could make it true. She kept promising consequences as if she owned the word. The strangers adjusted their posture when the crowd reacted, feeding off approval like actors chasing applause. Phones zoomed in on Tracy's wrists, and the chat filled with instructions from people who had never seen the yard before. Someone typed, "lock him up," and HOA Karen nodded as if crowd-sourced judgment carried weight. I watched the deputy she'd summoned hesitate, torn between paperwork and instinct, and that hesitation told me everything. This was the seam, the place where a lie tears if you pull correctly. I didn't raise my voice because volume is a tool for people who don't have jurisdiction. I didn't rush because speed favors the person telling the story first. I let HOA Karen finish her performance because performers expose themselves when they believe the scene belongs to them. The cuffs stayed on long enough to make the damage real, and short enough to keep the line clean. When the moment came, it would not be dramatic. It would be decisive. The crowd would not be convinced. It would be corrected. HOA Karen would not be argued with. She would be documented. The lie would not be shouted down. It would be outlived. This was the opening, the shock that locks attention and refuses release. Everything that followed would move in one direction only, forward, until the noise fell away and only consequences remained. Before HOA Karen ever stepped onto my property with borrowed badges and rehearsed outrage, there was a long, quiet stretch of life she never bothered to learn about. Our cabin wasn't a weekend indulgence or a flex. It was a retreat carved out after years of work that taught me the value of distance from noise. I'd spent most of my adult life in federal service, learning how authority actually functions when it's stripped of performance and ego. Authority, real authority, isn't loud and it isn't theatrical. It's procedural, documented, and patient, and it exists to reduce chaos rather than manufacture it. That distinction mattered long before flowers hit the dirt, because it shaped how I responded to pressure when it arrived, wearing khakis and confidence. Tracy understood that difference instinctively. She's a third-grade teacher, someone who spends her days managing emotion without humiliating children for having it. Her authority comes from consistency, not threats, and from trust, not fear. We bought the cabin together because it represented a shared boundary, a place where neither of us had to perform or defend who we were. It sat on unincorporated county land, outside the reach of any homeowners association, a fact we confirmed carefully before signing anything. We wanted quiet, not conflict, and we paid for that quiet with diligence and paperwork. HOA Karen never read those documents, but I did. My career had trained me to respect lines, especially jurisdictional ones. I'd watched cases fall apart because someone crossed a boundary they didn't understand, and I'd seen good intentions turn criminal the moment someone pretended authority they didn't possess. In federal work, impersonation isn't a technicality, it's a rupture, because it undermines the system people rely on when things go wrong. That's why I document first and act second, why I verify before I speak, and why I don't escalate unless the facts demand it. HOA Karen saw restraint as weakness because she'd never learned what restraint costs. She, on the other hand, had built her identity on proximity to power rather than responsibility for it. HOA Karen had spent years inserting herself into other people's decisions, convincing herself that enforcement equaled virtue. She collected titles the way insecure people collect proof, and she wore them as armor against accountability. Somewhere along the way, she stopped distinguishing between concern and control, and the line disappeared entirely. By the time she noticed us, she wasn't looking for compliance. She was looking for validation. The first signs were small and absurd, the kind of things most people laugh off. Binoculars on a porch, notes about community appearance left on windshields that didn't belong to any community but the county, questions about permits that didn't exist. I recognized the pattern immediately, the way a story builds itself when someone needs a villain to justify their involvement. Tracy noticed it too, and felt uneasy, not because she was afraid, but because she sensed the attention wasn't about rules, it was about fixation. In my line of work, fixation is always a warning sign. People who fixate stop gathering information and start collecting confirmation. They don't want to know what's true, they want to prove what they already believe. HOA Karen had convinced herself that standards were slipping and that she was the last defense against decay. That belief gave her permission, in her own mind, to escalate without reflection. She didn't ask who we were or what applied to our land. She decided what we represented and moved accordingly. My authority had never needed an audience, and that's why I didn't announce it. Federal authority isn't a threat you wield to win arguments. It's a responsibility you carry quietly until it's required. I didn't introduce myself with my title because titles aren't tools for neighbors, and because I understood how quickly a situation can distort when identities become the focus instead of behavior. HOA Karen assumed silence meant ignorance, and that assumption fed her confidence. The cabin itself became a symbol for her, a place she couldn't control but desperately wanted to. It sat outside her imagined jurisdiction, and that fact alone made it intolerable. When Tracy decided to plant flowers, it wasn't rebellion, it was care, an act as ordinary as breathing. But to HOA Karen, it was defiance, a visible reminder that her reach had limits. Limits make people like her reckless. She began documenting us without permission, photographing our yard, as if evidence could be manufactured through volume. She spoke in language that sounded official to people who didn't know better, stringing together phrases like community standards and violation protocol, as if cadence could replace law. I watched it happen with a mix of concern and disbelief, recognizing the early stages of a self-constructed narrative. Once someone commits to that narrative publicly, backing down feels like erasure, and escalation becomes inevitable. Tracy asked me if we should confront her directly, and I told her no, because confrontation feeds fixation. You don't argue with someone who's auditioning for control, you document them, and let reality catch up. That approach had served me well in my career, where patience often does more damage to bad actors than force ever could. HOA Karen interpreted our lack of engagement as permission to advance. She recruited others, people who wanted proximity to her certainty, and dressed them in symbols that suggested legitimacy. A uniform here, a badge there, a clipboard thick with meaningless paper. None of it held weight, but together it created the illusion of process. Illusions are powerful to people who don't know what process actually looks like. That's how she built her stage, and that's how she convinced herself she was ready for the spotlight. By the time she stepped onto our property with her entourage, she believed her own fiction completely. She spoke in absolutes, framed herself as protector, and positioned Tracy as someone who needed saving. That move wasn't accidental, it was strategic, and it revealed how far she'd gone. Once you reframe a competent adult as a victim, you give yourself moral cover for almost anything. HOA. Karen didn't see herself as crossing a line, she saw herself as fulfilling a role. What she never considered was that my authority didn't come from the uniform I wasn't wearing. It came from years of accountability, from knowing exactly when and how to intervene, and from understanding the legal consequences of pretending. Authority isn't something you declare, it's something that arrives when conditions are met. She mistook performance for power and spectacle for safety, and in doing so, she built her entire plan on a foundation that couldn't support it. This backstory mattered because it explains why the shock of that morning didn't dissolve into chaos. It explains why I didn't shout, why I didn't rush, and why I didn't negotiate with someone who believed rules were props. HOA Karen had spent years practicing control without consequence, and I had spent years preparing for moments when consequence is the only language left. Those two paths were always going to intersect badly. When she snapped the cuffs onto my wife's wrists, she wasn't enforcing anything real. She was revealing everything false about her authority. And when that happened, the difference between us became impossible to ignore. She had noise and confidence, and a crowd hungry for drama. I had jurisdiction, documentation, and time. That imbalance would define everything that followed, even if she didn't realize it yet. HOA Karen did not wake up one morning and decide to handcuff my wife. That moment was the visible edge of a system she had been constructing for years. A private hierarchy built on intimidation, selective enforcement, and the quiet consent of people who didn't want to be her next target. She thrived in environments where rules were vague enough to be weaponized, and oversight was weak enough to be ignored. In her mind, power wasn't something granted by law. It was something seized through persistence and performance. She treated procedure like costume jewelry, flashy enough to impress from a distance, hollow enough to crack under inspection. She organized herself at the center of everything, not as a leader elected by peers, but as a self-appointed authority who decided what mattered and who didn't. HOA Karen spoke constantly about standards, but what she really enforced was compliance with her moods. Some neighbors were forgiven for violations that others were fined for, not because of precedent, but because of proximity. If you flattered her, she overlooked you. If you questioned her, she documented you. That inconsistency wasn't a flaw. It was the mechanism. Fear works best when people can't predict the outcome. Her abuse followed a pattern I'd seen before in other contexts. First came surveillance, binoculars and notes, casual comments meant to test reactions. Then came documentation, photographs taken without consent, logs filled with accusations that sounded official enough to intimidate. After that came recruitment, pulling in people who wanted relevance, dressing them up in language and insignia that suggested authority. By the time she escalated to confrontation, she'd already rehearsed the scene in her head dozens of times. The cabin was just the stage she chose to perform on. What made her dangerous wasn't intelligence, it was certainty. HOA Karen believed deeply in her own righteousness, and that belief insulated her from doubt. She didn't see herself as someone abusing power, she saw herself as someone correcting disorder. That mindset allowed her to justify increasingly extreme actions while maintaining a self-image of virtue. Every time someone backed down, paid a fine, or avoided conflict, it reinforced her sense that she was effective. Silence became endorsement in her world. The structure she built around herself rewarded loyalty over legality. The people she pulled into her orbit didn't verify her claims because verification would have cost them their sense of purpose. They liked the uniforms, the clipboards, the feeling of being part of something that mattered. HOA Karen fed that hunger by framing dissent as danger and compliance as community service. Once people accepted that framing, they stopped asking where her authority came from and started defending it reflexively. She relied heavily on public shaming as a tool. Notices weren't private, they were performative, posted where others could see. Confrontations were staged for maximum visibility, ensuring that even if she lost the technical argument, she won socially. The crowd mattered to her more than correctness because crowds create pressure, and pressure creates compliance. She understood that most people would rather submit quietly than risk being labeled a problem. Her fixation on our property followed this exact script. The cabin represented a challenge to her imagined jurisdiction, a place that didn't bend when she pushed. Instead of investigating whether her rules applied, she doubled down on the idea that they should. That shift from legality to entitlement is where abuse hardens. Once someone believes they deserve control, the absence of permission feels like provocation. She used fear selectively, applying it hardest to people she perceived as isolated or vulnerable. Retirees, single parents, newcomers, anyone without an obvious support system. Tracy fit none of those categories, but HOA Karen reframed her anyway, casting her as someone who needed intervention. That reframing wasn't about Tracy. It was about neutralizing me by attacking the relationship. Control over one person becomes leverage over another, and HOA Karen understood that instinctively. The fake badges and uniforms were not spontaneous purchases, they were investments. She wanted symbols that would short-circuit skepticism, objects that would trigger compliance before questions could form. Most people are conditioned to respond to authority cues, and she exploited that conditioning ruthlessly. She counted on the fact that few would challenge someone who looked official and spoke confidently, especially in public. Her abuse escalated because it worked. Each successful intimidation reinforced her belief that escalation was justified. There were no internal breaks, no mechanism for self-correction, because she had built her structure to silence criticism. Anyone who pushed back became evidence of the problem she claimed to solve. It's a closed loop that feeds on itself until something breaks it from the outside. What she never accounted for was the difference between social power and legal power. Social power is loud and fragile, dependent on perception and performance. Legal power is quiet and durable, grounded in statutes that don't care how convincing you sound. HOA Karen built everything on the former and ignored the latter entirely. That imbalance meant her structure could expand quickly, but it also meant it would collapse the moment it met resistance it couldn't intimidate. When she ordered my wife restrained, she crossed from harassment into criminality without hesitation because her internal narrative told her she was saving someone. That belief insulated her from the reality of what she was doing. In her mind, cuffs were protection, detention was care, and impersonation was necessary. That is how abuse justifies itself, by renaming harm until it sounds like help. The crowd that gathered that morning was not malicious. It was uninformed. They reacted to cues HOA Karen had trained them to respond to, not to facts. That distinction matters, because it explains how quickly support can evaporate when evidence appears. HOA Karen's entire structure depended on nobody looking too closely. The moment scrutiny arrived, the gaps became obvious. I watched her power flex and overextend in real time, recognizing the signs of someone who had never been challenged by consequences. She spoke faster when questioned, grew louder when ignored, and leaned harder on symbolism when facts were absent. Every move she made followed a script designed to overwhelm, not to persuade. That script works until it doesn't. By the time the cuffs closed around Tracy's wrists, HOA Karen's structure was fully exposed. The surveillance, the documentation, the recruitment, the public shaming, all of it converged into a single act that could not be reframed as misunderstanding. Abuse thrives in ambiguity, and she had just eliminated all of it. From that moment forward, everything she had built would be examined under light she couldn't control. She thought she was demonstrating the peak of her authority. In reality, she was triggering its collapse. The moment HOA Karen tightened her grip on the story, I loosened mine on emotion and locked onto documentation. Panic destroys clarity, but procedure creates leverage, and leverage was the only thing that would matter once the noise settled. I didn't argue with her claims because arguing legitimizes the premise. Instead, I began recording quietly, not just with a phone, but with the habits drilled into me over years of investigations. Every word she spoke, every command she issued, every object her accomplices touched became potential evidence the moment she crossed onto our property. Her people moved with confidence born of rehearsal, not law. The woman with the clipboard kept repeating phrases like, "for the record," as if repetition could conjure jurisdiction. The man with the fake badge read rights from a screen without understanding them, pausing awkwardly when Tracy asked questions he couldn't answer. HOA Karen narrated everything for her live stream, framing each action as necessary, benevolent, and urgent. What she didn't realize was that narration is a gift to anyone building a case, because it locks intent into the record. I noted the details she thought were invisible. The badge didn't match any known design. The uniform patches were stitched unevenly, generic enough to avoid scrutiny, until someone looked closely. The paperwork cited rules that didn't exist, sections that couldn't be found in any county code. She spoke in absolutes, but produced nothing verifiable. Those inconsistencies weren't just sloppy, they were diagnostic. They told me exactly how shallow her preparation really was. Tracy, even in shock, noticed things too. She kept asking to see credentials, to speak to someone official, to understand why this was happening. Each request was denied or redirected, and every denial added another layer to the record. Her confusion was genuine, and that authenticity mattered. It contrasted sharply with HOA Karen's performance, which grew more exaggerated the more it was questioned. Performances escalate when threatened, and escalation leaves fingerprints. The neighbors' phones were up, capturing angles HOA Karen didn't control. I saw them exchange looks as the story stopped making sense, saw uncertainty ripple through the crowd when questions went unanswered. Someone asked which HOA applied to the cabin, and HOA Karen deflected. Someone else asked why county deputies weren't present yet, and she promised they were coming. Promises without follow-through are another form of evidence, especially when they're made publicly. When the deputy arrived, the situation shifted from theater to consequence. Real authority has a different weight, a different rhythm, and HOA Karen immediately tried to absorb it into her narrative. She spoke to him like an equal, assumed familiarity, framed herself as a partner in enforcement. He listened politely, but asked questions she couldn't answer cleanly. Each pause, each glance at her paperwork, each request for clarification widened the gap between what she claimed and what she could prove. I didn't interrupt that process. Discovery isn't about speed, it's about accumulation. The deputy asked to see the basis for the arrest, and HOA Karen handed over documents that collapsed under even casual scrutiny. They cited non-existent committees, referenced authority she couldn't demonstrate, and leaned heavily on emotional language instead of statute. The deputy's posture changed subtly as he read, a shift I recognized instantly. Doubt had entered the frame. Meanwhile, her live stream kept rolling, capturing everything. The comments began to fracture, some still cheering, others asking uncomfortable questions. Screenshots multiplied, clips were saved. HOA Karen had built her power on visibility, and that same visibility was now preserving her mistakes in real time. You can delete posts, but you can't retrieve what thousands of devices have already stored. I began organizing the proof mentally as it appeared. Trespass was clear. Impersonation was clear. Unlawful detention was unfolding in front of witnesses. Conspiracy, if needed, could be inferred from coordination and preparation. Each element was present, layered, and documented. This wasn't a gray area, it was a mosaic, and every tile was falling into place without my having to touch it. The deputy asked HOA Karen directly under what authority she'd ordered Tracy restrained. She answered with a story, not a citation. She talked about safety, about standards, about community values. None of that answered the question. When pressed again, she grew defensive, accused him of undermining community efforts, and tried to reframe the inquiry as hostility. That reaction mattered, because people who possess real authority don't fear verification. At the same time, neighbors began stepping forward with their own information. Quiet comments turned into whispered confirmations that they'd paid fines, received notices, or been threatened with enforcement they never quite understood. Those stories hadn't mattered before because they'd been isolated. Now, in context, they formed a pattern. Patterns are proof's closest ally. I watched HOA Karen realize, slowly, that control was slipping. Her voice sharpened, her gestures widened, her language became more absolute. She doubled down instead of adjusting, a classic sign that someone has run out of options but refuses to accept it. Every escalation made the record cleaner because it stripped away plausible deniability. The deputy asked for names, and she supplied them proudly, unaware that each name connected another thread. He asked for dates, and she provided them loosely, unaware that vagueness would be tested. He asked for jurisdiction, and she responded with confidence instead of clarity. Confidence without foundation is brittle, and it cracks audibly when pressed. Tracy was released from the cuffs temporarily, while things were sorted out, a phrase that marked the beginning of the end for HOA Karen's authority. Once the cuffs were off, the fiction that they were necessary evaporated. That moment mattered more than any argument could have. Physical restraint is a line, and once you cross it without justification, you don't get to walk back the consequences. I began backing up files, syncing recordings, sending timestamps to secure storage, all without drawing attention. Evidence doesn't need an audience, it needs preservation. HOA. Karen was still focused on optics, still playing to the crowd, unaware that the real audience was growing elsewhere. Investigators don't cheer, they catalog, and they were already taking notes. The deputy stepped aside to make calls, and those calls didn't go the way HOA Karen expected. She paced, checked her phone, and tried to regain control of the narrative by speaking louder to the live stream. The comments turned sharper, less supportive, more skeptical. Someone posted a link to county records showing no HOA registration. Another shared a clip of the fake badge up close. The crowd murmured, and murmurs spread faster than cheers. Discovery isn't dramatic in the way movies portray it. It's incremental, methodical, and merciless. It strips away story until only fact remains. Watching it happen to someone who's built their identity on narrative is unsettling, because you can see the moment they realize belief isn't protection. HOA Karen's posture changed as that realization crept in. She stopped smiling. She stopped narrating. She started reacting. By the time the deputy returned, the proof was no longer theoretical. It was layered, corroborated, and public. HOA Karen had handed over everything she'd need to be held accountable, not because she was careless, but because she believed she was untouchable. Untouchable people don't hide their tracks. The shift was complete. What began as a staged alleged arrest over flowers had transformed into a documented case of abuse of authority, fraud, and impersonation. The discovery phase didn't require confrontation, only patience. The truth surfaced on its own, heavy and unavoidable, and once it was visible, there was no performance left that could obscure it. The confrontation didn't arrive as a single explosion. It unfolded as a series of quiet fractures that finally became impossible to hide. HOA Karen had built her authority on the assumption that no one would ever call her bluff in front of witnesses who mattered. That assumption died the moment the deputy's tone shifted from accommodating to procedural. You can hear it when it happens. The way questions get shorter and answers stop being optional. HOA Karen felt it too, even if she couldn't name it, and her performance sharpened into something brittle and desperate. She tried to reassert control by raising her voice, framing the deputy's questions as disrespectful and the crowd's doubts as betrayal. She reminded everyone that she was acting for the community, as if invoking that phrase could erase the absence of law beneath her feet. But the crowd was no longer passive. Phones stayed up, not to cheer, but to record. Neighbors who had once nodded along now whispered to each other, comparing notes, replaying moments they'd previously ignored. Public collapse doesn't begin with boos, it begins with silence where applause used to be. The deputy asked her, clearly and calmly, to explain under what statute she believed she could order an arrest on private property. Fei. Karen opened her mouth and closed it again, then launched into a story about safety concerns and prior incidents that evaporated under follow-up questions. Each interruption from him cut deeper because it was polite. He wasn't attacking her. He was clarifying, and clarification is lethal to people who rely on ambiguity. Her accomplices shifted uncomfortably. The man with the fake badge stopped making eye contact with the crowd and stared at the ground, suddenly aware that the uniform he'd worn so proudly now marked him. The woman with the clipboard fumbled with her papers, realizing too late that documentation without legitimacy is just paper. HOA. Karen noticed their hesitation and snapped at them sharply, trying to pull them back into formation. That moment, when she scolded them publicly, broke the illusion of unity she'd cultivated. Neighbors began speaking up, one at a time, testing whether it was safe to question her. A retired couple mentioned fines they'd paid without understanding why. A younger neighbor asked why her driveway citation had never come from the county. Each question landed like a small weight, added to an already strained structure. HOA Karen responded defensively, dismissing concerns instead of addressing them, and every dismissal pushed another person away. The live stream that had once been her shield became her liability. Comments scrolled faster, no longer uniformly supportive. People asked for proof, for paperwork, for names of officials she claimed backed her. She ignored the questions at first, then mocked them, then accused the commenters of being manipulated. None of it slowed the tide. Online audiences are fickle, but they're ruthless when they sense a turn. The deputy asked for the cuffs to be removed completely and ordered everyone to step back while he assessed the situation. That instruction alone shattered HOA Karen's posture. She protested loudly, insisting that Tracy needed protection, insisting that removing restraints would endanger her. The deputy replied simply that there was no legal basis for continued detention. The phrase "no legal basis" echoed through the crowd more loudly than any accusation could have. When the cuffs came off, Tracy rubbed her wrists and took a step toward me, and the crowd saw, unmistakably, that she was not afraid of me. That single visual contradicted the entire story HOA Karen had been telling. No amount of narration could undo it. People trust what they see when it aligns with what they've felt all along, and many of them had already felt something was wrong. HOA Karen tried one last time to reclaim the narrative by accusing the deputy of siding with a federal agent, by implying corruption and bias. The accusation fell flat because it arrived too late. Once authority shows its work, accusations without evidence sound hollow. The deputy didn't respond emotionally. He responded by asking her to provide identification and explain the badges her team was wearing. That request triggered visible panic. She stalled, talked faster, gestured wildly, and accused everyone present of misunderstanding her intentions. Intentions, however, are irrelevant when actions are documented. The crowd began to murmur openly now, not whispering anymore, and that sound fed on itself. Public confidence drains quickly when doubt becomes shared. One neighbor laughed nervously, another shook their head, and someone else said out loud what many were thinking, that this had gone too far. HOA Karen snapped at them, calling them ungrateful and ignorant of the danger she'd been protecting them from. The words landed badly. Protectors don't insult the people they claim to serve, and the mask slipped completely in that moment. The deputy stepped between her and the crowd, not to shield her, but to restore order. He informed her that she and her associates would need to answer questions downtown. The phrase "answer questions" changed the air instantly. HOA Karen's face drained of color, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she stopped speaking entirely. Silence settled, heavy and unmistakable. Her collapse wasn't dramatic in the way she'd imagined confrontation would be. There were no handcuffs snapped onto her wrists in that moment, no shouted victory, no theatrical justice. There was only the quiet realization, shared by everyone present, that she had no authority left to stand on. The crowd began to disperse, interest gone, now that the spectacle had shifted from entertainment to accountability. As people walked away, phones lowered, HOA Karen stood alone in the space she'd created, surrounded by the remnants of her performance. The badges no longer impressed, the clipboard no longer intimidated, and the livestream viewers dropped off in visible numbers. Power that relies on attention dies when attention moves on. I didn't say anything to her. There was nothing left to add. The confrontation had done its work without me needing to participate in it directly. HOA Karen's authority had collapsed under the weight of scrutiny, and everyone had seen it happen. That visibility mattered because it ensured the collapse couldn't be reframed later as misunderstanding or bias. The deputy finished gathering statements, thanked the witnesses, and told us we'd be contacted for follow-up. As he left, neighbors avoided HOA Karen's eyes, some out of embarrassment, others out of anger, all of them aware that something irreversible had occurred. Public collapse isn't loud at the end. It's hollow, and the emptiness left behind speaks louder than any accusation ever could. Once the crowd dispersed, and HOA Karen's performance ended, the real work began, the kind that never happens in front of cameras but determines how the story actually ends. Retaliation doesn't mean revenge when it's done correctly. It means response, measured and precise, delivered through systems that don't care about feelings or excuses. I contacted colleagues not to flex authority, but to ensure the record was preserved correctly, because mishandled documentation can undo even the most obvious violations. Every file, every clip, every statement gathered that morning was duplicated, time-stamped, and secured before anyone had the chance to reinterpret it. The county followed up quickly, faster than HOA Karen expected, because impersonation cases draw attention once they cross into detention. Investigators don't like ambiguity around badges and restraints, and they don't like civilians manufacturing authority that can get someone hurt. Statements were taken again, separately, with questions designed to test consistency rather than extract drama. HOA Karen's story fractured under that pressure, shifting slightly each time she told it, while the facts stayed exactly where they were. That contrast alone told investigators everything they needed to know. Experts from the county attorney's office reviewed the materials with a focus on intent. Mistakes can be excused, but preparation cannot. The uniforms, the scripts, the coordinated arrival, and the decision to restrain someone without legal basis pointed to planning, not confusion. Planning changes how charges are evaluated, and HOA Karen's months of preparation worked against her now, reframed as evidence of deliberate misconduct. She had documented herself extensively, believing she was building a case for enforcement, and instead she had built a file for prosecution. The livestream footage played a critical role, not because it was sensational, but because it captured unguarded moments she couldn't later edit. Her language toward Tracy, her instructions to her accomplices, her reaction when questioned, all of it revealed mindset. Experts look for those tells, the points where belief overrides caution. HOA Karen had spoken freely, assuming she was untouchable, and that assumption became her undoing. As the investigation expanded, neighbors came forward with their own experiences, now confident that speaking up wouldn't make them the next target. Patterns emerged quickly, repeated behaviors that demonstrated a long-running abuse of perceived authority. Each new statement reinforced the others, and the case stopped being about a single incident. It became about a system of intimidation that had gone unchecked because no one had challenged it publicly before. HOA Karen attempted to retaliate in the only way she knew how, through accusations and noise. She sent emails, posted updates, and claimed persecution, but those actions only added to the record. Experts are trained to separate signal from static, and her escalation read as panic rather than defense. Each message contradicted the last, and contradictions erode credibility faster than silence ever could. The response remained clinical throughout. No public commentary, no emotional statements, just process. That discipline mattered because it denied her the oxygen she needed to keep the conflict alive. Retaliation through expertise doesn't shout. It closes doors quietly and locks them. HOA Karen's access to platforms diminished. Her claims stopped gaining traction, and her name became associated with impersonation rather than enforcement. When formal notices arrived, they were unemotional and comprehensive. Cease and desist orders, no contact requirements, and summonses that didn't explain themselves, only instructed. HOA Karen tried to negotiate, to explain, to reframe. But expertise doesn't negotiate with narratives. It assesses facts, applies statutes, and moves forward. Each step reduced her options until the only thing left was compliance. Throughout it all, Tracy stayed out of the spotlight by choice. She didn't need vindication in public. She needed assurance that it wouldn't happen again. Experts understand that prevention is as important as punishment, and the measures put in place reflected that understanding. Boundaries were formalized, oversight increased, and the space HOA Karen once dominated was closed to her permanently. Retaliation, when done correctly, doesn't look like triumph. It looks like finality. Doors close, lines are drawn, and the chaos that once thrived on attention is starved into irrelevance. By the time the process finished its work, HOA Karen's influence had been reduced to a file number and a cautionary example. She no longer set standards, enforced rules, or commanded attention. She waited for instructions like everyone else. That shift, from performer to subject, was the most effective consequence of all. Victory did not arrive with applause or closure speeches, and it didn't need to. It arrived quietly, the way real endings usually do, through the absence of disruption rather than the presence of celebration. The cabin returned to being what it was meant to be, a place where mornings began without tension, and evenings ended without scanning the driveway or listening for footsteps. Silence replaced vigilance, and that alone was confirmation enough that the threat had passed. The official resolutions arrived by mail over the following weeks, thick envelopes with neutral language and no drama. They didn't recount the spectacle or acknowledge the humiliation. They simply documented outcomes. Orders were finalized, restrictions enforced, and responsibilities assigned. HOA Karen's name appeared only in procedural context now, stripped of titles and authority, reduced to a reference point in a system that no longer revolved around her. That transformation mattered more than any public apology ever could. Neighbors resumed routines that had been quietly altered during her rise. People stood longer in their yards, conversations stretched without glancing over shoulders, and small choices were made without preemptive fear. The environment shifted in subtle ways, the kind that don't make headlines but change how a place feels. Fear doesn't always announce itself when it leaves. It simply stops influencing decisions. Tracy returned to planting without watchers or interruptions. The marigolds grew where they were placed, unremarkable in any way except that they were allowed to exist. No measuring tapes appeared, no notes were left, and no cameras hovered from across the street. That normalcy was the point. The conflict hadn't been about flowers or rules. It had been about control, and control had finally been removed from the wrong hands. HOA Karen did not vanish dramatically. There was no final confrontation, no last outburst, no attempt to reclaim relevance. She became quiet, then absent, and eventually just another resident subject to the same boundaries as everyone else. Her attempts to narrate the outcome faded when there was no audience left to perform for. Without resistance to provoke, there was nothing for her to enforce. The system did what systems are designed to do when they're allowed to function. It absorbed the damage, corrected the misuse, and moved forward without ceremony. No one needed to gloat, because the correction itself was sufficient. Authority, once misplaced, had been reclaimed by process rather than personality, and that shift held. There were no lessons given publicly, and no statements released. Those who needed to know already did, and those who didn't were unaffected. That restraint mattered. It ensured the end stayed an end, not the beginning of another cycle of attention. Finality depends on refusing to reopen doors that conflict thrives on. Life resumed in small increments. Coffee on the porch without scanning the road, windows open without concern, guests arriving without explanation. These moments don't look like victories from the outside, but they are what justice feels like when it's done correctly. Not loud, not validating, just stable. HOA Karen's influence lingered only as a memory, and memories lose power when they're no longer reinforced. People stopped referencing her, then stopped thinking about her entirely. Her presence in the narrative dissolved the way fog does, unnoticed until it's gone. That disappearance was complete in a way no punishment could have achieved. The cabin remained, unchanged and unconcerned with what had passed through it. It held no record of the conflict beyond the absence of it. The land didn't remember the raised voices or the false authority. It simply returned to stillness. That indifference felt appropriate. Not everything needs to be commemorated. Tracy stood in the garden one morning, hands in the soil, sunlight on her shoulders, and nothing else intruding on the moment. No commentary, no supervision, no threat, just the quiet certainty that it wouldn't be interrupted again. That image mattered more than any document filed or order issued. It was the outcome reduced to its simplest form. I did not check for updates after that. There was no reason to. When something is finished properly, it doesn't require monitoring. The process had concluded. The boundaries were set, and the space was reclaimed. Watching further would have implied doubt, and there was none left. The road stayed clear. The yard stayed open. The cabin stayed quiet. HOA Karen went silent.